If you take everything that Belarus and Ukraine and Russia, the belligerents, do, put into a single bucket, they are collectively the world's largest supplier of the first column, second largest for the second, and so on. I could speak for hours on this one slide. I did so at the CIA for 4 hours back in October. Yeah, that was no fun at all, because they're like asking all these questions, but they won't answer any of mine. When the Soviet system collapsed back in the 1990s, the entire industrial base just went down, but they didn't lose their power generation. Now, the Soviet system was one of the few parts of the world that didn't have access to bauxite, which is the precursor material for aluminum. So what they did in the 90s, since they had all this spare electricity and no industrial production, is they imported all kinds of bauxite from other places, used their spare power to turn it into metal and then export it. Most of that bauxite came from either Australia or Ireland, two countries that have been relatively enthusiastic about sanctions on the Russian system. So that's shut down. Titanium, the ore comes from Ukraine, it's processed in Russia. So that's gone to zero. You guys remember Brexit? I mean, isn't it hilarious that we don't even think about the Brits anymore? As an American, I really enjoy that. Okay, when the Brits left the EU, they neglected to figure out what was next. And they've come to the conclusion, grudgingly, that the only way that Britain will be a successful economic player moving forward is if they enter into a free trade deal with the North Americans, primarily the United States. We've got some very clear ideas on what they have to do to make that happen. One of the many, many, many things that they're going to have to do is leave the Airbus family of European aerospace companies and join Boeing. Britain's contribution to Airbus are engines and wings. Most of the aluminum from the former Soviet world goes to Airbus. Most of the titanium goes to Airbus. So the future of European aerospace are jets without titanium, aluminum engines, or wings. Talks amongst yourselves. All right, what else? The blue, neon, and platinum. These are core components in semiconductors. The platinum, the palladium, the rhodium, those are all core materials to regulate electrons. And the neon is used in cartridges which focus the apertures of the etching lasers in the semiconductor fab facilities. Now, neon is made in a two-step process. Step one, you have an air separation unit which is attached to a steel mill. In the former Soviet world, those are almost exclusively in southern Russia. They are all under sanction and they all are barely operating anymore. The second stage is you take your first stage air separation and all the gases that you don't use when you're making steel. So anything that's not nitrogen or oxygen, you put into a canister, you send it off to this more advanced facility and you separate out all the trace gases, helium, argon, carbon dioxide, neon. Those facilities were in Mariupol, and Mariupol is gone. So we've lost now 70% of global neon, which means in about a year, we have to figure out what we don't need microchips for, because we won't be able to make as many. So aerospace, automotive, agriculture, satellites, phones, we don't know. Oh, it gets better, because not everyone can make all microchips. We and the Taiwanese and the Japanese and the Koreans, we make the really high-end ones and the medium quality ones. But the bargain basement ones, the ones that are like in your smart pen, those all come from China. Guess where the other 30% of global neon comes from? China. So the one type of chip I would argue that we can get just fine without, maybe the only ones that we're going to have. And the technical economic term for a situation like this, where you've got a disconnect between supply and demand because of security reasons, it's roughly fuck. Okay, the brown. Russia's the world's #1 wheat exporter. It's invaded the world's 5th largest wheat exporter and is deliberately targeting every piece of physical infrastructure it can see, with an extra emphasis on agricultural infrastructure. No way we're not going to feel that soon. But it's the red that really worries me the most, because the Russian space is the world's largest supplier of the stuff that allows people to grow their own food. Of most concern, 40% of global potash comes from Russia and Belarus. Now, the story varies greatly based on which specific nutrient or combination you're looking at, but somewhere between 20% and 40% of all of them have been reduced out of the Russian space. One of the weird little things about Russia is most of their petrochemical facilities were built in the 60s under Khrushchev. And the only reason they're still operating is you've had a lot of Western technology and Western investment and Western workers basically applying a lot of high-end duct tape to keep it all working. And they are now all gone. And we are already seeing industrial accidents in Russian industry that are so big, not that we can see them from orbit, we can detect them from orbit. What we're looking at here is a pipeline map. Specifically, we are looking at the green pipes. Those are the oil pipes, and the two arrows are pointing at a pair of ports, one on the Baltic Sea in the north, that is Primorsk, and one on the Black Sea in the south, that's Novorossiysk. And the reason that these really matter is insurance. And I can just see everybody like, you cannot have a vessel go into a port, out of a port, or go through a constrained waterway like, say, Suez without an insurance policy. And as of the first of the year, the Europeans said, no ship can get one of their policies. That's 90% of global coverage. In addition, the global reinsurance companies, those are firms that insure insurance companies, without sanctions in play again, just said, we're never touching another Russian vessel again. Now, you're going to see in the news things about the price cap. That's all wrapped up into this. And everyone talks about the price cap because, ooh, sexy, they can only get like $40, whatever. It's the insurance that really matters, and it's already gone. So we have seen in just the last week and a half, exports out of the Russian space drop by about 1.5 million barrels a day. Things get really fast because this isn't Texas. In Texas, if for whatever reason the ports can't get rid of the crude, they just shut in the well. They don't like to do it, but they can do it. But in Russia, if you shut in a well in the permafrost, which is where most of this stuff comes from, it freezes solid. And the water that comes up as a byproduct turns into ice, and when water, we're in Louisiana, you're like, what? What's ice? When water freezes into ice, it expands and it pops the pipe from the inside. Now, they've got about 1.5 million barrels a day that's further west that's not on the permafrost. That they can turn on and off. Any more than that, they're cutting into the permafrost wells. And the last time the permafrost wells went offline, it was 1989. The Soviet system collapsed and they lost the entire network. And it took them 30 years to repair the damage. It's not quite right. It took Western techs 30 years to repair the damage, and the Western techs are gone. So we can very easily see a scenario where 2 to 4 million barrels a day of Siberian crude goes offline and does not come back for decades. And energy is not a normal product. You know, if you can't get wheat, you can eat corn. If you can't get corn, you can eat soy, whatever. If you can't get fuel, things stop. If you need a gallon of gas to get to work, but you can only get 9/10 of a gallon, not only will you pay whatever you have to do to get that last little bit, the price you pay for that determines the entire market. So just losing 2 million barrels a day of Siberian crude, that's enough to jack energy prices up by $60 easily. And there's more where that came from. So remember, green's oil, right? We're now looking at the reds. The reds are natural gas. We're going to start with that blue line. That blue arrow at the top. That's the noun failure. That's the Nord Stream pipeline. It's not the marginal supplier for the Germans. It's their primary. It's 40% of the total. So, a 2% change in supplies can generate a 50% change in price. This is 40% of their total demand. And back in September, somebody blew it up. It's gone. It's not coming back. Can't be repaired because there's now water corroding it from the inside. It's been too long. Americans talk a good game when it comes to paranoia about energy security. We're like, oh my God, energy independence. We got to get it. We really don't care. We bring in energy from Canada or Mexico or Saudi Arabia, and if we don't think anyone is really watching all that closely, we'll happily take a bunch from Venezuela. You can't do that in Germany. Precision manufacturing in a tough neighborhood. And not only do they bring in the natural gas to generate power, that's not its primary use. Its primary use is for petrochemicals. And those petrochemicals are not exported. No. They're kept in-house to be processed into regular manufactured goods. It's the base of the entire system. And it's stopped. Now, they have replaced that 40% with 7 different marginal suppliers. And so prices are 6 and 7 times, as a rule, of what they were before the war. Now, if you've been following the news there recently, they're having a freakish heat wave in Germany, too. It hit 50 degrees on New Year's in Berlin, which is like 185 billion degrees above normal. And so they're not using a lot of natural gas right now, and prices are really under control. But that's what it took. They shut down their industrial usage of the stuff. They halved their electricity generation, and it took a freak heat wave for them to get things back under control. And in order to do that, they only had to pay 7 times market price for the natural gas. Can you imagine what happens with a cold snap? And they're never going to refill with Russian natural gas again. They can't. Oh, and it'll get worse because those red arrows, that's the backup plan. Pipes that go through the conflict zone in an artillery war. Folks, if you want a Beamer, buy it now. This is the last model. You should probably get 10 years of parts too. But we're looking at the end of the German manufacturing system in less than 2 years. The closest natural gas to Germany that's not Russian is in Nigeria. That's a 15-year program at least to get it online in there.